A falcon vanishes mid-flight, taking government secrets with it. Welcome to Silent Case File. I am your host, Pendleton. Tell me, where are you tuning in from tonight? Your comments keep these mysteries alive. Let's uncover the truth. It was a grey and blustery morning in late November when the knock came at the door of our Baker Street lodgings, rousing Holmes from his violin and me from my teacup. The coals had long since settled into a dull glow in the hearth, and the fog beyond the window was so thick one could scarcely see the outlines of the hansoms clattering along Marylebone Road. Holmes rose with his usual languid grace, setting his instrument aside with care. "That, Watson," he murmured, "is not the knock of a tradesman nor of Mrs. Hudson with our breakfast tray. Observe the precision. 4 raps, evenly spaced. That is a man trained to conceal urgency beneath a mask of composure." Before I could reply, the door opened to reveal a tall, spare figure clad in a long travelling coat, the hem still damp from the morning's mist. His face, though drawn, carried the unmistakable imprint of the military, firm-jawed, neatly moustached, and bearing a weathered complexion that spoke of long years abroad. "Mr. Holmes?" he asked, stepping into the parlour. "My name is Colonel Archibald Weatherby. I believe I am in need of your services." Holmes inclined his head slightly, motioning to the fireside chair. "You come early, Colonel, and from some distance by the look of your boots. May I offer you tea or brandy, depending on whether your case requires warmth or courage?" The Colonel allowed a faint smile. "Brandy, if you please. I come from Portsmouth this very morning. The matter is both urgent and delicate." He accepted the glass from Holmes and took a measured sip. "3 nights ago, a military courier bound for Whitehall was found unconscious near the rail lines outside Guildford. His dispatch case had been cut open, and the sealed packet he carried, containing naval deployment strategies for the Levant, was gone." Holmes's expression did not change, but I knew that beneath his calm exterior his mind had already begun its intricate dance. "And Scotland Yard?" Holmes asked. "They've been informed, naturally," the Colonel replied. "Inspector Lestrade is involved, but I was urged, discreetly, to consult you before word of the theft spreads. If this matter becomes public, it could spell catastrophe for our Mediterranean fleet." "A courier attacked, secret documents missing, and no word from the thief?" Holmes asked, steepling his fingers. "None, but the strangest detail is this. The only witness claims to have seen a bird, a falcon, fly from the scene that night, carrying something glinting in its talons." "A falcon?" I repeated, incredulous. "Yes," said Weatherby, his voice low. "A black peregrine with a red band about its leg, and that's not the first time such a creature has been seen. Over the past month, similar sightings have occurred at naval installations in Plymouth and Dover, always just before a security breach." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes glittering. "A trained bird of prey used to conduct espionage, now that Watson is a marvel of ingenuity." "Colonel, I accept the case. Tell me everything you know. Names, locations, routines, however minor." As Weatherby began his account, Holmes moved to the desk and withdrew a well-worn map of southern England. He traced his finger from Portsmouth to Guildford, then to London, lips pursed in thought. "I suspect," he murmured to me as Weatherby paused for breath, "that this is no ordinary theft, Watson. We are not dealing with a common traitor, but with a mind both calculating and theatrical, a mind that has turned nature itself into a co-conspirator. And with that, our case, as bizarre as any we had encountered, had begun." The fog outside thickened as if the city itself wished to keep the secrets of the Falcon from coming to light. But Holmes, I knew, would not rest until every feather of the mystery had been plucked and every motive laid bare. Colonel Weatherby spoke in clipped tones, each syllable weighed with the precision of a man accustomed to sensitive matters. As he outlined the courier's route from Portsmouth to Guildford, Holmes made no effort to interrupt, though I saw his eyes flicker with intensity as certain details were revealed. The courier, Lieutenant James Ellicott, left the Portsmouth Naval Office at exactly 1900 hours, bearing sealed orders intended for Admiral Worthing at Whitehall, the colonel continued. He was to arrive by rail, unaccompanied, to avoid drawing attention, but the train was halted briefly near Guildford by what the crew assumed was a mechanical fault. It was during that unscheduled stop that Ellicott was attacked and the packet stolen. Holmes tapped the arm of his chair, almost absently. Conveniently timed for a falcon's descent, if one were trained to such precision. Curious. There was no sign of forced entry, Weatherby said. The carriage door was ajar, but the courier insists he was alone and saw no one enter. He recalls only a sharp sting at his neck, possibly a dart or injection, and then waking up 2 hours later with his satchel torn open. His revolver remained untouched. The only thing missing was the envelope containing the orders. "And the witness who reported the bird?" Holmes inquired. "A signalman named Harcourt," said Weatherby, withdrawing a folded report from his coat. "He was stationed at a signal box just beyond the track. Claims to have seen a dark shape, a large bird, he insists, glide toward the halted train and vanish into the trees with something metallic in its claws. He dismissed it at first as a trick of the light until he heard of the robbery." Holmes glanced at me with a gleam. "And the red band?" "Yes, he mentioned that quite distinctly. A red band about the bird's leg. He even drew it in his logbook." The colonel laid the sketch on the table, a crude but unmistakable likeness of a falcon in flight, a scarlet ribbon visible around one limb. "Most interesting," Holmes murmured. "We are dealing with a creature trained to retrieve or perhaps deliver, a messenger of sorts. But a falcon of this type cannot act independently. It needs a handler, someone who understands avian behavior, who has the patience to school a bird for precise flight and recovery." "Precisely why I've come to you, Mr. Holmes." "I assume you've kept the matter from the press." "Of course. As far as they are concerned, Ellicott was injured in a fall and will return to duty shortly. Not even the Admiral's aides know the truth." Holmes stood and moved toward the window, parting the curtains slightly to study the mist that coiled about Baker Street. "Colonel, I would like to examine the scene near Guildford personally, including the signalman's post, but before we do that, we must pay a visit to a man in Lambeth, a certain Professor Armitage, an eccentric ornithologist who has, in the past, bred birds of prey for the British Museum." Weatherby raised a brow. "You think he may be involved?" "I think he may tell us whether such a feat is even possible," Holmes replied. "And if so, who in England possesses the skill and the motive to turn falconry into espionage?" The fog had lifted slightly by the time we boarded a cab and made our way to Lambeth, though the city retained its usual veil of grime and smoke. The professor's home was modest, tucked between a pawnshop and a warehouse, but the cries of exotic birds from within announced our arrival before Holmes could knock. Professor Armitage was a thin man with wild tufts of white hair and a permanently startled expression. He greeted Holmes with familiarity, though with visible caution, when introduced to Colonel Weatherby. "A military matter, is it? Well, well. You've brought odd questions to me before, Holmes. I still recall the time you asked whether a macaw could mimic a pistol shot." Holmes did not smile. "This concerns a peregrine falcon, black plumage, scarlet leg band, trained, apparently, to steal." At this, the professor's interest deepened. "Good heavens! Yes, yes, I know of such training, but it's not common. Falcons are capable, certainly, but the training takes years. You'd need a master falconer, someone with endless patience, and a certain coldness of heart, I dare say. Coldness of heart? Watson asked. Armitage gestured vaguely to the caged kestrel nearby. You cannot develop that kind of control without breaking the bird in subtle ways. Starvation cycles, brutal reinforcement. It's not a hobby for gentlemen. I'd wager it's someone who treats animals as tools. Do you know anyone with such capacity and an interest in codes or secrets? Holmes asked. Armitage considered. Not many, but there was one fellow, Caleb Merrow, used to study here in London. Brilliant falconer, but he had odd ideas. Believed birds could replace pigeons as military couriers, claimed he could train them to recognize insignia and even snatch documents mid-flight. He left for Istanbul some years ago. Is he still abroad? Returned recently, I think. Rumours place him near Dover. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Dover, a site of one of the earlier breaches. This cannot be coincidence. Weatherby shifted in his seat. Then we must arrest this man at once. No, said Holmes firmly. If Merrow is indeed behind this, he will be cautious. Far too clever to be caught by a sudden knock on the door. We must let him believe he is still unseen. For now, Colonel, I suggest you send discreet inquiries about Merrow's movements and any financial dealings. We must also determine whether he has any links to Guildford or the railway line. As we returned to Baker Street, Holmes spoke little. He sat with his chin resting on his steepled fingers, eyes closed, but mind evidently racing. The pieces of the puzzle were forming: bird, handler, victim, but the final picture was yet obscured. That night, as I laid down my pen, Holmes stirred in the armchair and murmured, "Watson, there's something unspeakably elegant about using a falcon for theft. It bypasses locks, ignores guards, and leaves no footprints. And yet, it also exposes the perpetrator's need to impress. Vanity, my dear Watson, may yet prove our greatest ally." The fire crackled low in the hearth as a gust of wind rattled the panes. Outside, London slumbered beneath its familiar veil of smoke and silence. But within our rooms the game had begun in earnest. The following morning found Holmes already dressed and poring over an unfolded railway map of the southern counties, a steaming cup of black coffee untouched beside him. I entered the sitting-room in time to hear him muttering to himself. Portsmouth, Guildford, Dover, each one touched by this avian spectre. And now a name, Caleb Merrow. We have a falconer, but not yet the hand that feeds him. I cleared my throat. You didn't sleep. I closed my eyes long enough to see what the signalman missed, he replied absently. This was not an improvised theft, Watson. It was orchestration. The bird was only the final note in a score, composed with almost military discipline. Holmes looked up. I sent a wire to Inspector Lestrade an hour ago. We are to meet him at Waterloo Station. He has arranged transport to Guildford, where the signalman, Harcourt, awaits us. Within the hour, we were on the train, the rhythmic clatter of wheels on track serving as a counterpoint to Holmes's restless pacing. Lestrade met us at the Guildford station, his coat collar turned high against the biting wind. I must say, Holmes, he began with a sneer of restrained irritation, I expected a stolen document, not a blasted bird-watching expedition. And I expected a competent investigation. But one learns to live with disappointment, Holmes said evenly. Have you questioned Harcourt? I have. He stands by his tale, but I find it more likely he mistook a crow for a falcon. Then let us hear the man ourselves, Holmes replied, already striding away from the platform. We arrived shortly after at the modest signal house, a squat red brick structure perched beside the stretch of track where the courier's train had mysteriously halted. Harcourt, a burly man with coal-smudged hands and sharp grey eyes, greeted us with visible suspicion, but answered Holmes's questions without hesitation. Yes, sir. I saw it clear as day, or rather, clear as the fog would let me. A bird, large and dark, came swooping down just as the train pulled to a halt. No, not a crow. I've worked these rails for 20 years. This was sleek, fast. Falcon, I'd wager, though I've never seen one act so deliberate. And the red band? Holmes asked. Scarlet eye, almost glowed in the lantern light. Direction of flight? South, into the woods behind the hill, lost sight of it past the ridge. Holmes crouched beside the rails, fingers brushing the ground like a bloodhound testing the scent. He then stood abruptly and turned toward the tree line. Come, Watson, Lestrade, remain with Harcourt and question every crewman on that train again. Someone must have seen the door open, even briefly. Without another word, Holmes plunged into the brush beyond the signal house, following a narrow deer path that wound among moss-covered stones and fallen branches. I followed closely, though the mud threatened to claim my boots at every step. Some 200 yards in, Holmes halted beneath a great yew tree whose low branches bent under the weight of morning damp. Observe, Watson. I leaned closer and saw a small iron ring hammered into the tree trunk, scarcely visible among the bark and moss. A thread, no more than a length of fine twine, hung loosely from it, the end frayed and fluttering in the breeze. A tether point, Holmes said softly. Our bird was trained to return here after its prize was seized, and here, look. He stooped and retrieved something half buried in the leaves, a metal clasp shaped like a hawk's talon, small enough to fit over the leg of a falcon. It's stamped, he said, examining it with his lens. MH23, likely a serial or craftsman's mark, but not from any British outfitter I know. He pocketed the clasp and continued onward until we reached a clearing. Here the earth had been disturbed. A circle of flattened grass surrounded a scorched patch of earth, as though a small fire had been hastily extinguished. Holmes knelt and sifted the soil between his fingers. Charcoal? Mixed with bone fragments? Our friend used fire to destroy something. Or perhaps someone. The implication chilled me. You think the stolen documents were burned? Unlikely. If one goes to such lengths to steal, it is not to destroy, but to possess. No, this fire was either a decoy or... He broke off. His eyes narrowed at something glinting near a cluster of brambles. Reaching in, he retrieved a single feather, glossy black, tinged with copper at the edges. Tied around the quill was a sliver of waxed paper. Holmes unfolded it delicately. A single word was scrawled across the scrap in blocky capitals, Kadesh. We stood in silence, the forest suddenly oppressive around us. Kadesh, I repeated. A name? An ancient city, a battlefield, but also Holmes's brow furrowed. It was the code name for an intelligence operation in the Crimea, an infiltration effort involving false troop movements and double agents, long buried. Very few outside military intelligence would recognize the term. Then this is not just theft, I said. It's war. Holmes gave a grim nod. A message left in arrogance. Or perhaps a challenge. We returned to the station as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the rails. Holmes's silence during the journey back to London was absolute, save for one sudden remark, as the lamps of Baker Street came into view. Vanity, Watson. Our enemy cannot resist leaving signs of his brilliance. That will be his downfall. He said nothing more until we were once again within our rooms, the fire rekindled, and the feather laid upon the mantel. "Tomorrow," Holmes said at last, "we go to Dover. Caleb Merrow may yet be the key, but I now believe he is not acting alone." And with that he turned to his violin, drawing from its strings a note so thin and high it seemed to pierce the very veil of mystery that surrounded us. The following morning, Holmes was uncharacteristically silent during our journey to Dover. The coastal winds buffeted the train as it clattered eastward, the chalk cliffs emerging ghost-like through the low fog as we neared our destination. Holmes sat across from me, eyes closed, fingertips pressed together in meditation, his brow furrowed with the tension that only a particularly elusive thread could produce. I ventured a question. "You believe Merrow is not acting alone?" "I am certain of it," he replied without opening his eyes. "A man may train a bird, Watson, but a falcon cannot choose its target, nor chart the movement of a sealed military courier. That requires a second mind, one attuned to bureaucracy, routine, and secrecy, a traitor embedded in the system." The word traitor hung heavily between us, the train's whistle the only reply. Upon arriving in Dover, we made our way through the narrow streets toward a modest inn on Castle Hill Road. According to Armitage's contact, Merrow had taken up rooms there under the name Mr. Fairbairn. A man of solitary habits, he rarely interacted with the other boarders and often returned after nightfall, smelling faintly of salt and fire smoke. Holmes, ever cautious, instructed me to wait at the inn's modest dining room while he surveyed the premises. Within a quarter hour, he returned and beckoned me upstairs, his movements feline in their restraint. "The landlord confirmed that our Mr. Fairbairn is indeed Merrow. He rents the attic suite overlooking the cliffs. I've examined the hallway. No obvious traps or wires. Let us pay him a call." We ascended quietly. At the far end of the hall, the door stood closed, faint light leaking beneath the threshold. Holmes rapped softly. A pause, then. "Yes." Holmes adopted a tone of bureaucratic blandness. "Telegram for Mr. Fairbairn." A shuffle, a bolt sliding back, and the door cracked open. Holmes acted in an instant. He thrust the door wide and stepped through, and I followed, revolver at the ready. Caleb Merrow was a wiry man of middling height, with a prematurely lined face and hawk-like features that gave him a severe, almost monastic air. His hands, though, were the hands of a craftsman, calloused and deft, and one of them still held a leather gauntlet lined with dried blood. "What is the meaning of this?" "You know precisely what it means, Mr. Merrow," Holmes said, his voice cold. "We are here about the Falcon." Merrow's eyes darted toward the window. Open, I now noticed, the sheer drop beyond framed by gull cries and churning sea. "There's no bird here," he said slowly, "and I've broken no laws." Holmes advanced, gesturing toward the corner of the room, where a stand, disguised poorly under a burlap cloth, held a perch, talon scratchings visible on the wood. Beside it, a metal box, partially open, revealed small leather harnesses, rings, and folded strips of paper, all faintly dusted with white feathers. "No bird, you say?" Holmes lifted the box's lid further and retrieved a miniature metal canister, perfectly shaped to attach to a bird's leg. "And this—" He withdrew a folded page bearing what seemed, at first glance, to be a list of numbers. At second glance, I realized they were coordinates, naval positions. "Would you care to explain how you came by these?" Merrow's face twisted with defiance. "I trained the bird, that's all. I don't know where it went or what it carried." "But someone told it where to go," Holmes replied evenly, "and someone ensured it intercepted the courier's train at precisely the right moment. I was paid to prepare the bird. I didn't ask questions. The man who hired me said it was a demonstration, something to show a foreign client. I assumed it was a bluff." Holmes studied him closely. "Describe the man." "Tall, English, well-dressed, gloved, called himself Ashcroft." Holmes stiffened. "Ashcroft?" The name meant nothing to me, but Holmes's reaction was unmistakable. "He wore gloves, you say?" Holmes asked. "Even indoors?" "Yes." Holmes turned to me. "That, Watson, is our traitor. Ashcroft is a pseudonym known within a narrow circle of intelligence officers used in the event of internal audits, a fail-safe, but only a few would even be aware of it. Merrow's bravado had faded. He now looked genuinely shaken. I swear I didn't know. I thought it was all theatre, some eccentric nobleman playing spy. Holmes was already moving. He took from his coat a folded slip and scribbled rapidly upon it. "Watson, send this to Colonel Weatherby at once. Use the telegraph office on the High Street. It is imperative that he reviews all staff at Whitehall and the Admiralty with recent foreign travel or unexplained wealth, and anyone with access to codename records." I obeyed at once. When I returned, half an hour later, Holmes had taken a seat by the hearth, deep in conversation with Merrow, who now seemed resigned to cooperation. Holmes was listening intently, twirling the bird's leg clasp between his fingers. "It was genius, really," Merrow was saying. "The Falcon was trained to return to the perch at Guildford. He told me to ensure it recognized the scent of the leather harness as a trigger. Once the bird had the object, it would retreat, just as trained." "And the name Kadesh?" Merrow shook his head. "He left that scrap himself. Said it was a private joke." Holmes exhaled through his nose. "Not a joke. A message to those who would understand it. Kadesh was the code name for a deception operation. Our man is signaling that this theft is only the beginning, that a campaign of misdirection is underway." That night, Holmes and I walked the Dover cliffs in silence. The moon hung high above the sea, and the cold air felt sharp with urgency. "Do you think Merrow told us everything?" I asked. "Everything he knows, yes, but not all that there is to know. Ashcroft, or whoever hides behind that name, is still out there, Watson, and I suspect he is preparing to strike again." "And the Falcon?" "I doubt we'll see it again," Holmes said quietly. "Its purpose was served, but the mind that conceived of it is still working." As the waves pounded the shore beneath us, Holmes turned his gaze inland toward the darkness beyond the town. "We have seen the talons, now we must find the hand that holds the leash." By the time we returned to Baker Street the next evening, London had descended into a thick mist that clung to the gas lamps like breath upon glass. Holmes appeared unusually grave, and though he moved with his customary precision, there was a tautness to his gestures that I had come to associate with a deeper anxiety beneath the surface. Colonel Weatherby was waiting for us. He rose from the fireside as we entered, his uniform immaculate, but his expression drawn. Holmes removed his gloves slowly, watching the colonel as one might study a chessboard mid-game. "You received my telegram?" "I did," Weatherby replied, handing Holmes a folded sheet, "and acted at once. We've discreetly begun a cross-check of staff movements and financial irregularities at the Admiralty and Whitehall. There is one man of interest, Percival Triggs, a senior clerk in naval intelligence. Long service, excellent references, but last year he took an unexpected leave to the continent, claimed a family emergency in Lucerne. We've since found no record of such a family existing." "Does he have access to codename registries?" "He does, and he would know the meaning of Kadesh." Holmes scanned the report, his lips tightening. "And where is Mr. Triggs now?" "Still at his post. We've kept the investigation internal." Holmes nodded. "Good. We must not disturb him yet. But I believe we can now reverse the deception. If this man has gone to such lengths to avoid detection, we must give him reason to believe he has succeeded." Watson raised an eyebrow. "You intend to bait him?" "Precisely, but not with a trap of our own design. Rather, we shall borrow his own stratagem, a bird." Weatherby looked momentarily confused, but Holmes had already crossed to his desk and removed the Falcon's harness and the miniature canister we had retrieved from Merrow's quarters. "We shall send a message," Holmes continued. one crafted to convince our traitor that the operation remains secure and that a second courier shipment is scheduled, something too valuable for him to resist. If he intercepts it or sends another bird, we shall be ready." Weatherby was silent a moment, then gave a single, firm nod. "We'll need cooperation from my department. Can you prepare the message?" Holmes took up his pen and with great care began composing a brief but deliberate document on stiff parchment. The language was convincingly bureaucratic, laden with strategic ambiguity, dates, and phrases like "secondary dispatch route secured via Worthing, December 3rd. He folded it crisply and placed it in the canister. "The message is fictitious," he said, "but credible. We'll ensure it passes across Triggs's desk in the morning. The rest, Colonel, is up to your discretion. Allow him to believe it's genuine. Let it circulate no more than necessary. And if he takes the bait, then we follow the bird." It was 3 days later, in the early hours of December 3rd, that the signal came. A watchman stationed near the freight rail yard at Clapham reported sighting a dark bird, larger than a pigeon, marked with a red band, descending toward a covered goods carriage that had been deliberately placed to mimic an official military courier's transport. Holmes and I had taken lodgings nearby under assumed names. When the report arrived, he sprang into action with all the precision of a sprung trap. We were on the scene within minutes, crouched behind a stack of crates just beyond the train shed. "There," Holmes whispered, pointing through the dense fog. The silhouette of the bird was unmistakable as it landed silently on the carriage roof. Its claws scraped faintly against the wood before it darted down to the open window and disappeared within. Moments later, a figure emerged from the shadows near the platform, a man in a long coat and hat pulled low. He approached the carriage, looked both ways, then extended a gloved hand through the window. When it withdrew, the bird perched docilely upon his arm. Holmes's breath caught. "Watson, do you see?" "Yes, the gloves." Holmes rose. "Now!" We stepped forward at once, revolver in hand. The man turned, startled, and in the haze I saw the briefest flicker of defiance in his eyes. "Mr. Triggs?" Holmes said coolly. "Or should I say Ashcroft?" The man's shoulders slumped slightly. He did not deny it. "I wondered when you'd come," he said, voice dry. "Though I admit I thought it might be Weatherby who put it together." "You underestimated your own arrogance," Holmes replied. "As I had hoped, you couldn't resist a second performance. The Falcon was never meant to retrieve a second document. It was meant to bring us to you." Holmes gestured, and within seconds, Weatherby's plainclothes men emerged from the fog, surrounding the platform. Triggs held up his hand, almost amused. "So clever, Mr. Holmes, but surely you realize this changes nothing. What I took is already beyond your reach." "Perhaps," Holmes said, "but even the most elegant of thieves must eventually come down to roost." As Triggs was led away, the Falcon still clutched quietly on his gauntlet. Holmes watched in silence. He stood perfectly still until the man vanished from sight. "It's over then?" I asked quietly. "For him, yes," Holmes murmured. "But we must assume others remain. A mind like his rarely works in isolation. There are echoes of him in the system still, shadows in offices and files." He turned to me. "And yet, for tonight, I'll permit myself a small comfort. The Falcon has flown, Watson, and the secrets, for now, are safe." That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes reclined in his armchair, his gaze fixed not on any particular object, but rather on some abstraction known only to himself. I sat across from him, the fire between us crackling gently, warming the chill that had seeped into our bones after the long hours in the Clapham yard. "So it ends," I said, more to fill the silence than out of conviction. "Triggs will stand trial. The documents remain uncirculated. Surely, Holmes, you've earned a rare moment of satisfaction?" He stirred, then gave a short, dry laugh. "If only I believed it had ended, Watson. But there is a flaw, subtle but persistent, that troubles me." I frowned. "You doubt Triggs's guilt?" "Oh, he's guilty, make no mistake," Holmes said. "But he is not, I suspect, the architect. He is too cautious, too risk-averse. He only acted when he believed he was completely unseen, and even then he relied on Merrow's Falcon rather than any method of his own invention. The use of the bird, the theatrical signature, the message left at Guildford, those gestures bear the imprint of another personality entirely." I leaned forward. "You think he was acting under orders? Or under influence? Consider, Watson, the coordination required, the precise moment the courier's train was halted, the tether in the woods prepared in advance, a falcon trained to return to a location near Guildford rather than to Merrow's own lodgings. Triggs might have had access, but he lacked the nerve and imagination to conduct such a performance alone." I nodded slowly. "Then there's another player still out there?" Holmes's eyes flicked toward the hearth. "Yes, and he or she is more dangerous than Triggs precisely because they remain unseen." At that moment there came a knock at the door, quick, firm and familiar. I opened it to find Inspector Lestrade wrapped tightly in his greatcoat and visibly winded, as though he had come at pace. "You'll want to hear this, Holmes," he said, without preamble, stepping into the parlour and tossing his gloves onto the table. "We searched Triggs's residence this evening, found a hidden compartment behind a bookshelf. Inside, a locked case, only partially burned. Looks like he tried to destroy it before he left for Clapham." Holmes was already reaching for his magnifying lens. And what was inside? A ledger, partial but legible. Names, dates, coded references to what appeared to be shipments, naval ones from the look of it, and 2 payments traced back to a London bank. But here's the strange part. The names listed aren't just military. One of them is a civilian, Marion Hargreave. I saw Holmes's brow tighten. He rose slowly and crossed to his writing desk, withdrawing a slim notebook from a drawer. He flipped through it, paused, and held up a page. "Hargreave," he said. "She was secretary to Admiral Troughton until earlier this year. Dismissed quietly. No public cause given?" Lestrade nodded grimly. "We made inquiries after you wired about code names and internal access. Hargreave's name came up once, tangentially. It was thought she'd been removed due to suspected indiscretions, but no formal investigation followed. She's not been seen in public since." Holmes turned sharply to me. "You see, Watson, Triggs was the inside man, but not the planner. Hargreave fits the profile: civilian position, proximity to sensitive material, and motive. Quiet dismissal, disgraced but not charged. Perfect conditions for resentment to fester into something more." Lestrade sighed. "Problem is, she's disappeared. No residence listed, no family contacts. It's like she dropped out of London." Holmes's gaze narrowed. "Then she didn't vanish. She was hidden." He crossed to the window, drawing back the curtain to study the fog-strewn street. "Watson, prepare to travel. We must retrace her last known movements. Lestrade, obtain her employment records. I want to know the exact date of her dismissal and the name of every person she interacted with in the final 2 weeks of her tenure." By the next morning, we stood at the gates of a modest boarding house in Kensington. According to the records Lestrade unearthed, Hargreave had lived there during her employment under Admiral Troughton. Holmes had traced a single unconfirmed sighting of her by a neighbour who claimed to have seen a woman resembling Hargreave boarding a carriage on the morning of her dismissal. The carriage bore no markings but was driven by a uniformed coachman, odd for a woman of Hargreave's modest means. The landlady, a pinched woman with wary eyes, answered the door and regarded us with tight suspicion. "Miss Hargreave," she said. "Gone, sir. She left abruptly, took none of her belongings. Someone came for her, a man in black, very polite, said he was from the Admiralty. She didn't argue, just walked out with him like she'd been expecting it." "Did you see his face?" Holmes asked. "Briefly. Pale, clean-shaven. Wore a hat. Looked foreign somehow." Holmes nodded, thoughtful. "And the room?" "Untouched since. I didn't have the heart to let it again." She led us upstairs to a small, neat room overlooking a narrow mews. Holmes searched it methodically. Drawers were empty, the wardrobe bare, but beneath the floorboard near the window, Holmes found a hidden envelope, weathered but still intact. Inside, 2 sheets of paper. The first bore a sketch, the unmistakable outline of a falcon, claws outstretched, descending upon a map. The second, a torn page from a journal, read simply, "He promised revenge, not just for me, but for all who've been discarded. The bird will carry more than secrets. It will carry ruin." Holmes looked up. This was never about profit. It was about spectacle. Triggs was her means, the falcon, her metaphor. We've arrested the hand, but the voice that commands it still sings. As we descended into the street once more, the fog swirled thicker around us, muffling the city into silence. "Where now?" I asked. Holmes's reply was quiet, almost a whisper. "Now, Watson, we find the voice before the next song begins." That afternoon, as we returned to Baker Street through the thickening London fog, Holmes seemed more absorbed than ever. He walked briskly, not speaking, until we had reached the warmth of our lodgings, where he cast off his coat and sat before the fire without removing his gloves. The discovery of Marian Hargreaves' journal page had left him, I sensed, troubled in a way I had not seen before. "She is not merely a conspirator, Watson," he said after a long silence. "She is an ideologue, the worst kind of opponent, one who believes her actions to be righteous. She sees herself not as a criminal, but as an avenger of discarded servants. Triggs was only a pawn in a larger philosophy of revenge." I poured a measure of brandy and handed it to him. "But what can she do now? She has no position, no access. Surely with Triggs arrested and Merrow exposed, she's been cut off from her means." Holmes shook his head. "You underestimate her. She has moved beyond passive theft. That last line, 'Oh, the bird will carry ruin,' was not metaphor alone. The falcon was a demonstration, but now the true weapon is in motion." He stood abruptly and crossed to his desk, where he extracted a fresh sheet of paper and began writing a rapid series of notes, names, locations, symbols. I recognized one instantly, the name of a decommissioned naval base at Wycliffe Point. "Holmes, that base was shuttered years ago," I said. "Used now, I believe, for munitions storage." "Precisely," he replied, tapping the paper. "A perfect place for sabotage, unguarded, largely forgotten, but still holding enough firepower to cause considerable destruction. And look, this was one of the shipment locations listed in Triggs's ledger twice, once under its proper designation, and once, I believe, under an alias. Why would they list it twice? To divert attention, to imply redundancy or perhaps error. But no, it was deliberate, a signal encoded for someone like Hargreave, who already knew where to look. He seized his coat and motioned for me to follow. "Come, Watson, if I am correct, then tonight she will act, and we must be there to prevent it." We took the last southbound train and reached Wycliffe by nightfall. The station was deserted, the cold wind off the sea cutting through our coats as we followed a narrow dirt track through the darkness. The old base loomed ahead, a series of squat stone buildings partially embedded into the cliffs. A rusted chain-link gate blocked the road, but Holmes found it unlatched. We stepped through into silence. The air here smelled of salt and oil. A low fog drifted along the ground, swirling around crates and forgotten gun emplacements, like some long-dead battalion waiting to be recalled. Holmes led the way with quiet determination, moving from shadow to shadow, pausing occasionally to listen. Then he stopped, held out a hand. "Do you hear it?" I strained, and there it was, a faint, high whistle. Not human, a bird's call. We moved forward until we reached the munitions storehouse, a long brick structure half buried in the cliffside. Its iron doors were ajar. Holmes knelt beside the threshold, inspecting the disturbed earth. "Boot prints, 2 sets, one recent, smaller, likely a woman's." A movement overhead caught my eye, and I looked up just in time to glimpse a bird, dark, fast, vanishing over the roofline. "She's here," I whispered. Holmes nodded. "And she's made her delivery." We entered the storehouse cautiously. The interior was unlit, lit only by Holmes's electric lantern. The light fell across rows of wooden crates stamped with naval ordnance seals. At the center of the room was a work table, and on it a small copper device ticking faintly. Strapped to its side was a wax-sealed envelope marked with a red falcon. Holmes inhaled sharply. "Watson, we must disable this, now. It's a clockwork igniter." He moved swiftly, extracting a small toolkit from his coat. I kept watch, heart pounding as he opened the casing with delicate precision. "She's not trying to vanish, Watson," he said as he worked. "She's making a statement. This was meant to explode just after midnight. When the next maintenance crew was due to arrive, maximum casualties, the note was to identify the cause. Can you disarm it? If we're lucky." He twisted a screw, then cut a wire with surgical steadiness. The ticking ceased. Holmes exhaled. "There, now let's see what she intended to say." He opened the envelope. Inside was a folded sheet bearing Marion Hargreaves' unmistakable handwriting. "You gave your loyalty to titles. We gave ours to truth. You buried us in silence. We answer now in flame." "She wanted this to be seen," Holmes said quietly. "A manifesto disguised as a warning. She meant to burn the evidence and elevate the crime into an idea." Suddenly, from the far end of the storehouse, we heard movement. A figure emerged from the shadows, slender, hooded, but unmistakable in carriage. "Holmes!" I warned, raising my revolver. "No," Holmes said calmly. "Put it away." The figure stepped forward into the light. It was Marion Hargreave. Her eyes were tired, but her voice, when she spoke, was unshaken. "You shouldn't have come." Holmes regarded her levelly. "You left too many clues, Miss Hargreave. The bird's path led back to you, and you are too principled to run." "I had no intention of running," she said, "only of being heard. And it seems I was, after all." Holmes studied her. "You are more dangerous than Triggs because you act out of belief, but belief does not excuse murder." "It prevents it," she replied. "The bomb was never meant to kill, only to frighten, but they would have buried the message like they buried me." He stepped closer. "You've made your point. Surrender, and I will ensure your story is heard in court. Try to flee, and it ends here." She looked at him for a long moment. Then slowly, she reached into her coat and withdrew a small brass whistle. She placed it on the ground. "I trained the second bird myself," she said. "It's gone now." Then she held out her wrists. Holmes took her arm, gently but firmly. "You were wrong to think silence was your only answer. Now let the truth speak in the light." As we escorted her out into the cold night, the sea broke gently below the cliffs. Holmes did not speak again until we reached the station. "She is dangerous, Watson," he said at last, "but not evil. The difference, thin as a feather, lies in what she did not do." And as we boarded the train back to London, I could not help but feel that the case had not closed so much as transformed, from theft and treason to something quieter, more human, the enduring question of what people will do to be seen and what Holmes will do to make sure they are understood. Our return to London in the pre-dawn hours was a quiet one. Marian Hargreaves sat across from us in the railway carriage, hands folded in her lap, eyes unfocused as the lamplight flickered against the frosted window beside her. She neither pleaded her case nor sought pity. The silence between her and Holmes was not hostile, far from it. It was the silence of minds that had, for a fleeting instant, recognized each other even if they could never agree. At Baker Street, Inspector Lestrade awaited us with 2 constables and a carriage prepared to take her to a secure holding location. Holmes gave only the briefest of explanations, emphasizing her surrender and cooperation. "She did not complete the act," Holmes said. "There is no corpse, only an idea, unfulfilled." Lestrade grunted. "Ideas can be just as dangerous as bullets, Holmes." "True," Holmes murmured. "But bullets fly faster than the law. She has, for now, chosen the latter." When the constables led her away, she turned to Holmes and said with no trace of sarcasm, "Thank you." He did not respond. The house fell into an exhausted hush after her departure. Holmes took his customary seat by the fire, lighting a cigarette with deliberate calm, while I sank wearily into the armchair opposite him, boots still dusted with the white chalk of Wycliffe Point. "You were right, Holmes," I said after a moment. "She was never going to disappear. She wanted to be caught." "She wanted a voice, Watson, and she wanted the moment of confrontation, not with the law, but with me, with someone who would understand what she had built. It is a peculiar vanity, one shared, I might add, by our friend Triggs. He engineered betrayal like a ledger entry, she like a play." He rose and crossed to his desk, where he retrieved a file that had lain untouched for several days. Triggs's ledger, recovered from his rooms and partially burned. Holmes flipped through the brittle pages, eyes scanning quickly. He stopped at a particular entry, underlined twice, its ink smeared, but still legible. "Watson," he said slowly, "do you remember the second time Wycliffe was mentioned in this ledger?" "Yes, listed under 2 names, once plainly, once coded." Holmes nodded. "But not as an endpoint. Look here. This second listing has an adjoining annotation. Delta 7 confirmed. Canary compromised." I frowned. "What does it mean?" "It means Wycliffe wasn't the last act, it was merely the overture." Canary compromised, a signal perhaps that their internal man at the Admiralty was no longer secure. And Delta 7, an obscure naval designation, one I hadn't considered relevant until now. He strode to the bookcase and retrieved a slim blue volume. British Naval Signals and Ciphers, 1874-1886. After flipping rapidly through the final index pages, he stopped at the entry he sought. Delta 7, he read aloud, was a classified designation for a floating decryption room, a converted merchant vessel moored near Gravesend and used during the Egyptian campaign for intercepting telegraph codes. It was decommissioned years ago. But not dismantled. Holmes's eyes shone. Precisely. If one wished to transmit stolen codes without drawing notice, using outdated equipment known only to a few, it would be an ideal ghost ship, unwatched, forgotten, yet functional enough for a final message. I stood. "You think someone other than Triggs or Hargreave is still using it?" "I think we have not yet seen the true end of this operation. Hargreave's attempt at Wycliffe may have been hers alone. But this is different. This was a fallback route. If they suspected exposure, they would flee, not blindly, but towards something already prepared. A vessel, floating just out of sight. An hour later, we were aboard a small launch from Wapping Pier, churning steadily downriver toward the widening estuary beyond Greenwich. The chill morning air bit sharply at the skin, and fog hovered above the water like a gauze veil. Holmes stood at the prow, wind tugging at his coat, eyes fixed ahead. We reached Gravesend just after dawn. With guidance from an old naval chart and the cooperation of a sleepy harbour official, we identified the vessel, an iron-hulled merchantman now listing slightly on her moorings, her paint long faded, and her name, Argus, barely legible through the grime. Holmes went aboard first. The deck creaked underfoot, the air inside thick with damp and decay. We found the remains of signal equipment in the main cabin, dust-covered but operational. More telling, however, was the presence of a lantern still burning low and a tin cup half full of tea. "Someone has been here within the last hour," Holmes said, "and not for the first time." In the adjacent cabin we discovered a small cot, a table strewn with paper, and a single oil lamp still warm to the touch. Holmes's eyes roamed quickly over the papers. Many were blank, but others were carbon copies of intercepted dispatches, some dating as recently as the previous week. "A rat's nest," he murmured. "But where is the rat?" A creak from above sent us both spinning toward the hatchway. Holmes held up a hand, motioning me back, then ascended the ladder swiftly. I followed a few steps behind. We emerged onto the mist-shrouded deck. At the far end stood a solitary figure, motionless, one hand resting on the rail. It was a man in a naval coat, weather-beaten and silent. When he turned, I recognized him faintly. Captain Elwyn March, once a decorated analyst for the Admiralty, believed retired after a scandal involving misappropriated telegrams. "Holmes," March said evenly. "I was beginning to wonder if you'd arrived before I slipped away." Holmes stepped forward. "No need for theatrics, March. This isn't a novel. You're not at the helm anymore." March gave a thin smile. "Not theatrics. Closure." Holmes glanced once at me, then back to March. "You ran the operation." March's smile faded. "Only after it became clear the Empire would never punish its own. They covered up fraud, buried the loyal, promoted the cowardly. Triggs was useful. Hargreave was broken. I gave them purpose. And you always arrive when it's too late." "Not this time," Holmes said quietly. March's hand moved subtly toward his coat, and I reached for my revolver, but Holmes raised a warning hand. March withdrew not a weapon but a leather pouch. Inside were the remaining intercepted messages. "All of it," he said. "The rest of what we took. Let the world see it or let them burn it. It won't matter now." He turned back to the water and spoke without looking. "You know what they'll do to me. I expect no mercy." "I offer none," Holmes replied. "But I offer truth." Lestrade's men arrived moments later, having followed our trail from shore. March did not resist. As he was taken below, Holmes stared out at the river, face unreadable. "The Falcon," he said softly, "never truly flies alone. There's always a keeper in the shadows." And with that, the last piece of the mystery settled into place, not with an explosion, nor a confession, but with the quiet, inevitable return of the truth to light. We returned to Baker Street in the late afternoon, wearied from the long hours and the finality that had settled over the case like a closing curtain. March's arrest had been swift and without resistance, but as the tide rolled out beneath the hull of the Argus, I could not shake the feeling that something else lingered in the wake. Holmes, for his part, was quiet, dangerously so. He sat with a sheaf of recovered documents spread across the carpet, like the bones of a puzzle yet unsolved. "It fits, Watson," he said at last, "and yet it does not satisfy." I looked up from the case notes I had been reviewing. "We've uncovered the core of the operation, Triggs on the inside, Hargreave the ideologue, and March as the architect. What remains?" Holmes tapped a single sheet with his forefinger. It's a transmission copied from a naval cipher, sent not to March, but to a recipient marked only as Vesper. Dated 4 days after Hargreaves' dismissal. Note the language, neutral, bureaucratic, but its contents are entirely manufactured. It references a fleet movement that never occurred. You believe it was bait? Precisely. A test, but not one March would have sent. He already had his channels. This was sent to him from within the Admiralty. I rose, a cold tightness settling in my chest. You're suggesting March had a superior. Holmes's expression was grim. Or a handler. He rose and began to pace. March was no mastermind. He had vision, yes, but not reach. The ghost ship at Gravesend, the recovered dispatches, the tactical misdirection, all of it shows planning, but it also suggests insulation. He was protected. That cipher message, addressed to a code name, implies there's another layer. Someone who fed March false intelligence, possibly to test his network or to manipulate it. But to what end? Holmes stopped pacing and stared into the fire. That, my dear Watson, is the question I have yet to answer. But I fear it is no longer merely a matter of espionage, it is something deeper, structural, institutional. A knock at the door startled us both. I opened it to reveal Colonel Weatherby, wind-blown and pale, his expression one of urgency. "Holmes," he said, without waiting to be invited in, "you must come with me at once. The Home Office. There's been a breach." Holmes was already reaching for his coat. When? Less than an hour ago, the Night Watch discovered a coded ledger missing. It contained field names, cipher variants, safe house locations, material dating back nearly a decade. Whoever took it knew precisely what to target. And the method? Weatherby hesitated. A bird, Holmes, a bird was seen flying from the rooftop. The same description, black falcon, red band. I felt my breath leave me. But the falcon was Merrow's, confiscated. We saw it caged. Merrow had trained others, Holmes said coldly. Or someone else has now mimicked the technique. Either way, the signature was left deliberately. A message. We rode with Weatherby in silence to the Home Office, where the crime scene had already been cordoned off. The narrow stone corridor outside the intelligence archives bore no sign of forced entry, no broken locks, no splintered doors. But inside, a single cabinet stood ajar, its contents emptied with surgical precision. On the desk nearby sat a feather, glossy black, marked faintly at the shaft with a crimson thread. Holmes examined it in silence, then turned to the window. It had been pried open from within. A set of small indentations marred the sill. Claw marks. He, Holmes said softly, or she, wanted us to know they were here. Lestrade arrived moments later, haggard and red-eyed. "Don't tell me! It's another bird, Holmes. I was just starting to sleep again." "Another bird," Holmes confirmed. "But not the same master. March is in custody. Hargreaves' network is exposed. This is either a copycat or a remnant of a deeper cell." Lestrade groaned. "What do you want us to do?" "Seal the intelligence offices. Double-check all personnel movements from the past 24 hours. But quietly. If the enemy still thinks we are unaware of what's been taken, we may have a chance." "Taken and then, what? Transmitted?" "Not likely," Holmes said. "Too soon. They're collecting, preparing something." We returned home in the small hours, the city dim and muffled beneath a low-hanging mist. Holmes resumed his vigil by the hearth, sorting through the recovered cipher pages once more. Then, without warning, he stopped. "Watson," he said sharply, "do you remember the phrase in Hargreaves' journal, 'The bird will carry more than secrets'?" At the time I believed it metaphorical, but what if it was literal? "You think they're transmitting more than intelligence?" I think they are transmitting code itself. Not just messages, but the machinery of decryption, the keys, the shifts, the patterns. A single document delivered correctly could unravel half our naval security. He turned a page over, revealing a series of markings previously dismissed as smudges. But beneath the lens they resolved into a cipher wheel, one modified from standard military issue. "This," he said quietly, "is not March's invention. It's older, and it's been improved." I stared at it, heart quickening. "So we've been watching the wrong enemy?" Holmes nodded slowly. "The Falcon, Watson, was a distraction. Beautiful, yes, precise and novel. But while we watched it soar, something else was already walking among us, a man or woman who knows both code and cover, who used Triggs and March not as agents but as screens." He leaned forward, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "The true thief, Watson, has not yet shown their face, and I fear they are not done." The street outside was still and dark, but Holmes did not move from the hearth for a long while. He sat with his fingers steepled beneath his chin, staring into the flames as though searching for something written in their flicker, some pattern, some hidden syllable in the language of fire. When he spoke again, his voice was low and certain. "The Falcon has flown, yes, but its shadow is still with us." By the following morning, Holmes's mind had taken on that peculiar intensity which, to an outside observer, might resemble stillness, but which I, having lived beside it for years, recognized as the most dangerous state of all. He did not pace, he did not speak, unless prompted. Instead, he sat motionless in his chair, eyes fixed on nothing, the fingers of one hand slowly tracing the edge of the cipher, page he had uncovered the night before. I brought him breakfast, which went untouched. He ignored the fire, the cold, even Mrs. Hudson's inquiries. It was as if some great equation had lodged itself within him, and the answer, though invisible, hovered just beyond the edge of articulation. Around mid-morning, Lestrade arrived, pale and unslept, his expression stretched thin by the demands of a crisis too intricate for his usual tools. "Holmes, we've scoured the staff records from the Home Office. No signs of forced entry, no unaccounted-for visitors. The only thing unusual, if you can call it that, is a junior cipher clerk who requested leave 2 weeks ago and never returned. The name was Morton Vale. Nondescript, clean record." Holmes stirred. "Vale!" Lestrade glanced at his notes. "A recent hire, quiet, background in foreign code systems, studied briefly in Vienna." Holmes sat up abruptly. "Vienna. That's where the Falcon-class cipher was first demonstrated in the Austro-Hungarian War College. It was dismissed by our people at the time. Too elaborate, but someone remembered." Lestrade shifted. "You think this Vale is behind it all?" "I think he may be the hand that shaped March's schemes and Triggs's betrayals. He trained them both to believe they were leaders when in fact they were only delivery systems. Vale is the algorithm behind the message, the mind behind the bird." He rose and crossed swiftly to the desk. "We must find where he went after his disappearance. His request for leave, where did he say he was going?" Lestrade consulted his paper again. It was vague. Family business in the north, no address, but there was a private locker left behind at his lodging house in King's Cross. Holmes was already reaching for his coat. Then we go to King's Cross. The house in question was a narrow brick building wedged between a tobacconist and a shuttered tailor's shop. The landlady, a matronly woman with a limp and a sharp tongue, remembered Vale only vaguely. Polite, quiet, very few visitors, paid in cash, disappeared without a word. She handed over a key to the locker in the cellar, warning us not to disturb the dust. What we found there was more than enough disturbance. Inside the locked compartment was a leather-bound folio filled with cipher keys, not just the ones known to March or the Home Office, but variations we had never seen. Some bore annotations in German, others in French, even Turkish. Among them was a folder marked Project Nyx. Holmes's breath caught. Nyx, the Greek goddess of night, darkness personified. That's what this is, a system designed not just to steal information, but to obfuscate it. Reverse encryption. You feed it truth and it returns lies. I flipped through the folio. It's a deception engine. Exactly. With this, one could send a message across secure lines and make it seem indistinguishable from official dispatches, false orders, false confirmations, ghost deployments, all wrapped in the skin of legitimacy. Holmes turned sharply to Lestrade. If Vale left this behind, he's either careless or he wanted us to find it. That suggests a second phase. We must determine what's been falsified already. We returned to Baker Street, where Holmes launched into a feverish comparison of recent naval and intelligence communications against the original message sets recovered from March's ship. I did what I could to assist, but I knew enough to stay out of his way once he had entered that rare state of total cognitive occupation. It was near sunset when he stopped, finger resting on a single dispatch marked for the Admiralty. Movement of Submarine Squadron B delayed, dry dock inspection scheduled at Portsmouth. It's wrong, Holmes said. I squinted at the text. What's wrong with it? Submarine Squadron B has been inactive for 3 months. Their lead vessel was decommissioned and sent for salvage. There's no reason for a dry dock inspection. Lestrade, looking over Holmes's shoulder, frowned. Are you saying someone forged this message? Worse, Holmes replied. Someone used Nyx to substitute a real message with a false one. A ship that doesn't exist cannot be followed, but its phantom creates a gap, one where a real ship could disappear. I felt my blood run cold. You believe they're planning to hijack a naval vessel? Not planning, Holmes said. They've already done it. Within the hour, we were aboard a ministry launch bound once more for Portsmouth, armed with full authority from Colonel Weatherby to inspect the yard. The dry dock in question was quiet, the foreman assuring us that nothing had arrived, but Holmes insisted on walking the entire length of the site. Near the end of the quay, beside an auxiliary loading dock, we found the evidence, tracks in the frost-marked stone, where something heavy had been lowered into the water, not recently, but just long enough ago for its absence to go unnoticed. Holmes crouched beside the marks and brushed them gently with his glove. A vessel was here, marked as a decommissioned hulk. But it wasn't scrapped. It was prepped, disguised, stripped of flags, then vanished. He rose slowly. And now, somewhere in the channel, or beyond, is a vessel with no name, bearing a code engine capable of imitating any fleet command in Her Majesty's Navy. Lestrade said nothing for a long time. Then, good God. Back aboard the launch, Holmes stood silently at the prow, the wind lifting the edge of his coat. His face was unreadable. This is no longer a case of theft, he said at last. It is an act of war, clever, bloodless, and launched under the cover of ink and feathers. I shivered, not from the cold. What now? We must find the ship, he said, before its silence becomes our signal. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of maps, intercepted signals, and long whispered conferences behind closed doors. Holmes became a spectre in motion, his presence felt in every room, yet never lingering long enough to be touched. I followed where I could, but even I, who had known him through the darkest corridors of human mystery, sensed we were now moving through something altogether more dangerous. Through cooperation with naval intelligence and Weatherby's direct authority, we assembled a list of all sea-going vessels unaccounted for in the last 2 weeks. Cross-referencing these with old dockyard manifests, Holmes narrowed our search to one, HMS Thales, a patrol ship, struck from the rolls for repairs 3 months prior then conveniently reclassified as scrapped. It had been scheduled for salvage, but the contract had never been fulfilled. The ship had vanished, its logbooks closed with bureaucratic finality. It was the perfect vessel, Holmes said, standing before the war table in the Admiralty's secured briefing room, small enough to avoid suspicion, large enough to carry code equipment, and known to few outside naval logistics. "But where is it now?" Weatherby asked. "Surely we'd have seen it." Holmes traced a line across the channel with a gloved finger. "That's the Brilliance. She wouldn't linger. She'd only appear when needed, transmitting false signals to redirect traffic, send fleets astray, or worse, initiate actions under our flag." At that he turned to Lestrade. "The last Nix-coded message we intercepted, remind me of its destination." Lestrade flipped through his notes. "A coastal signal station outside Calais, French territory, high encryption, non-reciprocal." Holmes nodded grimly. "She's anchored off the French coast in international waters, too far for casual observation, too close for comfort." It took nearly a day for a covert naval vessel, HMS Erebus, under Weatherby's command, to approach the coordinates in question. I was aboard with Holmes, of course. He would not remain behind, and neither would I. As the ship cut through fog and brine under cloak of night, tension built on every deck. Even the sea seemed to hush as we closed in. Just past midnight, a silhouette emerged, low, dark, and unmistakable. Thales. Holmes studied her through the spyglass. "No flag, no lights, but she's crewed. Movement on the deck. Armed men." The plan was swift and silent. A boarding party concealed under moonless skies led by Weatherby's men. We rode in with the tide, hugging the side of the ship until grapples found hold. I followed Holmes up the rope ladder, revolver at the ready. The deck was mostly quiet. A few guards, subdued without a sound. Below, the hold buzzed faintly with the sound of equipment, transmission coils, humming engines, and the clatter of telegraph keys. In the central chamber, we found it, the Nix terminal, encased in brass and whirring softly as it streamed out false communiques. At the helm of the device stood a young man, tall, composed, almost eerily serene. "Morton Vale," Holmes said. The man turned unsurprised. "Mr. Holmes, I had hoped I might finish my final broadcast before you arrived." "You built this," Holmes said, "and used it to frame March, to feed Hargreave her vengeance, to orchestrate thefts, diversions, and betrayal, all from behind a desk in King's Cross." "Not behind," Vale corrected him. "Beneath, always beneath, where no one looks." Holmes stepped forward. "Why?" Vale offered a sad smile. "Because systems lie. They write out their errors, classify them as weakness. Triggs, Hargreave, they weren't criminals. They were failed components. I gave them new function." "And now?" "Now?" Vale glanced at the Nix engine. "Now it ends, but it ends with understanding." He pressed a final key. The machine stilled. "You'll find a final message queued," he said, "addressed to your Admiralty. It includes a full decryption log, every code I created, every lie. I knew you'd find me eventually. Holmes always finds the truth." Holmes stared at him in silence. Vale raised his hands in surrender as Weatherby's men closed in. It was never about escape, only the perfection of the message. As he was led away, Holmes stepped to the Nix machine and removed its core. "We were never chasing a bird," he murmured. "We were chasing the wind that taught it where to fly." Later, back on English soil, the fallout began. Quiet arrests, hidden tribunals, a sanitized explanation for the disappearance of Thales. Hargreave would testify. Triggs would serve time. March would never speak again. He took his life in his cell 3 days later. And Vale, imprisoned but unrepentant, left behind pages of reflection that read more like a manifesto than confession. In the sitting room at Baker Street, Holmes held the Falcon's original harness in one hand and Vale's cipher wheel in the other. He turned to me. "This was never a mystery of motive," he said, "only of method. Crime was not in what they stole, but in how well they made it vanish." I asked, "Do you believe another will try, that the next thief will rise behind some newer name?" Holmes looked out at the city, smothered in fog once more. "Always. But now we know the flight path. And that, Watson, is where the Falcon finally failed." He set both items down and reached for his violin. Outside, the first flakes of snow began to fall.